Lecture 13, Nietzsche, the Ubermench, and the Will to Power.
In this, the last lecture on Nietzsche, I'd like to talk about two of his most famous and most notorious notions. The notion of the Ubermench, the Superman or Overman, and his idea about the will to power. The Ubermench, I'm convinced, is famous largely because of a play that George Bernard Shaw wrote parodying the notion called Man and Superman. It was a comedy and very successful. The fact is that the Ubermench really just appears in one book of Nietzsche and by no means in the whole book, and that's at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nevertheless, Nietzsche speaks of higher men all the way through his work, and the distinction between higher and lower is something which is absolutely essential to his thought. Zarathustra talks about the possibility of the Ubermench. He often talks as if the Ubermench is an evolutionary step. He says at one point, following Darwin, man is a bridge between the ape and the Ubermensch. There are many ways of understanding this, but I think for our purposes now, we should mention that Nietzsche's relationship to Darwin, in fact, is very complicated. He was clearly under Darwin's thrall in many ways. I pointed out a few lectures ago that in his epistemology, his views of truth, he had a view which was very much a kind of pragmatized form of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Nevertheless, with regard to Darwin as a whole, I think he took him to be much too much in the tradition of looking at man as the highest accomplishment of evolution. Probably not true of Darwin. He also saw Darwin as taking the thesis that survival of the fittest meant that the best survive. Whereas what Nietzsche is very concerned about is the idea that if you look at evolution, it's not necessarily the best that survive at all. There was a theory that was circulating a few years ago, courtesy of the novelist Tom Robbins, that said basically that the final stage in evolution, the last two creatures to fight it out, will be the cockroach and the gonorrhea bacillus. The idea is that basically evolution gives no guarantees of giving us the better. So I think we should look at Nietzsche's and Zarathustra's promise of the Ubermensch as a mere possibility, something to aspire for, something to dream about. As evidence for this, in the same speech where he talks about the Ubermensch, trying to turn on the townspeople and get them excited about this possibility of overcoming themselves and becoming more than they are, he introduces another character called the last man, where the idea is to get people truly disgusted with themselves and to see that this is another possibility for evolution, another way that we might turn out. And in fact, it's a way that is very close to the way we are. The last man is the ultimate bourgeois consumer, the ultimate couch potato. He, she, is a person who has no aspirations, is merely content, comfortable, satisfied. As Nietzsche puts it sarcastically, the last man says, "We have invented happiness," and blinks. The blink being, on the one hand, a sign of idiocy, on the other, a sign of just not wanting to see what life is really like. So, two possibilities. The Ubermensch, which clearly Nietzsche portrays as an ideal, and the last man, which is a kind of counter-ideal. In fact, precisely the ideal that would be defended by a great many utilitarians as the best that we could possibly have. To understand the Ubermensch, I think we should go back to the discussion of master morality and slave morality. Because when Nietzsche talks about master and slave morality, what he distinguishes there is strength and weakness. The difference is primarily one of power and also of independence. The master assumes his power, he assumes his abilities, and he aspires to excellence. He also does this in an important sense alone. Not that he doesn't have friends and allies, but there's a sense in which the values, the talents, the ideals that he pursues are very much his own. Slave morality, by contrast, is a morality of the weak. The slave is very concerned with what other people think. The slave is very concerned about not being different. The slave is very concerned, and primarily concerned, with defense, with protecting himself from those who are stronger. So the picture of slave morality that Nietzsche gives us, which he sometimes also calls herd morality, is of lots of weak people, most of us in fact, herding together for self-protection. What characterizes us as slaves is weakness. And weakness not necessarily physically, and not necessarily just in terms of our status in society, but Nietzsche makes it very clear that there's a sense in which weakness of spirit, weakness of soul, weakness of will is what it's really all about. The relationship between the master and the slave, consequently, looks something like this. The master is independent and powerful. The slave is relatively powerless and consequently resentful. And as we saw, slave morality is basically a reaction against master morality. Now, one way to understand the Ubermench is to understand the Ubermensch as a version of master morality. Or, as I ended one of the previous lectures, we might say that the Ubermensch is master morality spiritualized by 2,000 years of slave morality and its self-discipline. To characterize the Ubermensch in this sense, we might say, first of all, in contrast with slave morality, the Ubermensch is free of resentment. In fact, some of my colleagues would even define the Ubermensch as a character who is so free of regret and resentment that he can fully and enthusiastically endorse that thought experiment we called eternal recurrence. Would you like your life lived over and over and over again exactly the same? The Ubermensch is someone who can say with no hesitation whatsoever, yes, gladly I would accept this. But the idea of the Ubermensch as a step in evolution raises a number of problems for Nietzsche. Because first of all, as I said, it is by no means guaranteed that this is what we're going to become. But secondly, it is impossible for him, in some of the things he says, for us to become really anything. And this goes back to the kind of biological determinism I talked about in the previous lecture. There's a sense in which we are born as the creatures we are. We are born with our boundaries, limits, and the consequence is that what we become is in fact just ourselves. So, when it comes to aspiring to be the Ubermensch, one might say that for Nietzsche, this is absolutely implausible. One can't become something so much more than one is. The Ubermensch, it really is just a way of our looking at ourselves and seeing that we're really not so hot as we often think we are. He often makes enormous fun of those who would call for the improvement of man. And of course, here he's talking not just about Christians and the kind of transformation that Christianity is supposed to bring about, but also he's talking about the social movements of his day, and socialism in particular. We can think to our own century and all the horrors that have been imposed upon people by societies that have tried to change them from selfish, egoistic, capitalist to something more socialistic, more egalitarian, and so on. One thinks, for example, of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and one is horrified. But Nietzsche would say, of course you can't change people in that sense. People are as they are, and what we have to do is work within the realm of what we are. So it's implausible to say that we can aspire to be and work towards being an Ubermensch, but nevertheless, he continuously distinguishes in his philosophy between those who are higher and those who are lower. And higher and lower here typically refer to the will to power, something I want to talk about in some detail in a moment. But before we think that power here refers just to a kind of aristocratic status and just to a kind of military prowess, which in the ancient world that Nietzsche admired certainly would be the case, I think it's important to point out that the person who emerges as the higher example of human being in Nietzsche's works, more often than any other, is the German poet Goethe. Goethe was, he says,